Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of Marx in... Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of Christos Memos' Castoriadis and Critical Theory. The title of the chapter is Marx in Question. To what extent have Marx's ideas been responsible for the ongoing crisis both of Marxism and the labor movement? Was there something in Marx's argument that facilitated the petrification of Marxism, blocked the flourishing, and eroded the effectiveness of the anti-capitalist struggles? This chapter examines how Castoriadis shifted from a critique of totalitarianism and his analysis regarding the crisis of Marxism to a critique of Marx's own thought in an attempt to trace its metaphysical and problematic elements, which could be regarded as an obstacle to radical theory and practice. First, Castoriadis' critique of Marx is placed in a comparative perspective with the analogous critiques of Marx formulated by two other Greek philosophers, Kostas Axelos, 1924 to 2010, and Kostas Papaioannou, 1925 to 1981, with whom Castoriadis had not only biographical but also theoretical affinities. The section brings together and examines Castoriadis', Axelos, and Papaioannou's critique of Marx so as to outline the common basis of their critical confrontation with the Marxian theorizing, and at the same time to shed light on Castoriadis' intellectual debts and origins. The next section expands on Castoriadis' critique of Marx and presents his argumentation. Finally, the last two sections supply an anti-critique of Castoriadis' intellectual endeavour. They pinpoint the limitations of Castoriadis' critique, identify his contradictions, and question the purpose and direction of this effort. The last part of the chapter juxtaposes Castoriadis' reading and critique of Marx with other critical interpretations of Marx and sets out his critique in a broader critical and radical perspective. It concludes by exploring why Castoriadis' attitude towards Marx gave rise to misunderstandings and misappropriations. Section 1. Castoriadis, Axelos, and Papaioannou. Distinctiveness and the common basis of their critique of Marx. During the 1950s and 1960s, Castoriadis, Axelos, and Papaioannou attempted to reopen a dialogue with the original thought of Marx, aiming to develop a direct critique of his theorizing. Seeking the philosophical core of Marx's thought, they made an effort at the same time to grasp its origin, structure, and development with a view to finding the philosophical intuition, the thread that penetrates the whole of Marx's writings. It should be noted, however, that the critique of Marx provided by the three thinkers did not represent any, quote, national or, quote, Marxist school of thought. They neither formed a distinct group nor represented any kind of, quote, Greek Marxism. Unlike the Frankfurt School or the Budapest School or the Praxis Group in the former Yugoslavia, Castoriadis, Axelos, Papaioannou shared a common basis in their critique of Marx, but in no sense did they ever constitute a group or work collectively. They all have their own theoretical objectives and their own political intentions. Needless to say, one can neither see the three approaches and contributions as identical nor overlook their disparities. And these differences do affect the content of their critique. What brings the three Greeks together and renders them comparable, despite their distinctive arguments, is their common formative experience in both Greece and France, as well as their theoretical resemblance with regard to their critique of orthodox Marxism. Also, there is a common foundation in their critique of Marx, emphasizing key concepts which overlapped considerably. They all shared certain common assumptions and arrived from different perspectives at similar conclusions. The formative and existential experience of the Greek intellectuals, as well as their personal relations and theoretical exchanges, was a detriment factor. The formative and existential experience of the Greek intellectuals, as well as their personal relations and theoretical exchanges, was a determinant factor for the way in which Castoriadis approached the thought of Marx and formulated his later theoretical elaborations. In this sense, Castoriadis, Axelos, and Papaioannou's critique of Marx conveys a very precise meaning, and it is united in two key elements. A, their critique of Marx's deification of the concept of technique, which more or less penetrates his whole work and generates Marx's determinism, positivism, and technicist eschatology. And B, the Greek scholars saw Marx as a spokesman of Western humanism and civilization, and criticized him through the prism of classical Greek humanism as being deeply immersed in capitalist imaginary significations and metaphysical presuppositions. A. Marx and the metaphysics of technique. The peculiarity of Castoriadis', Axelos' and Papaioannou's reading of Marx's early writings stands in direct contradiction with that of both orthodox Marxism and the approach of humanist Marxists. Whereas orthodox Marxism rejected the continuity between the young and mature Marx, Marxist humanists pointed out the neglected humanist aspects in Marx's work. Castoriadis, Axelos, and Papaioannou read Marx's early writings as being imbued not only with radical and emancipatory elements, but also with technicism. In this context, the discussion of the concept of technique in Marx is a common thread running through the critique of Marx by the Greek scholars. Without making distinction between the young and the old Marx, they argue that Marx was trapped in his conception of technique. More specifically, for Axelos, the Hegelian influence penetrates through all levels of Marxian thinking. Nonetheless, Axelos argued that, quote, Marx knew Hegel and yet misunderstood the essential dimension of his thought. He recognized his greatness, and yet Hegel is a figure both present and absent in Marx's work, end quote. Marx's thought was linked to Hegel's theorizing and extended it dialectically. He developed and set in motion the power of negativity and the concept of alienation. Axelos asserted, however, that, quote, the dialogue or duel between Hegel and Marx is hardly conducted on the same level and on the same terrain. Marx makes a reply to Hegel using weapons that do not correspond to his thought, end quote. Marx pushed one side of Hegel's thought to its most radical and revolutionary consequences, but misconstrued other parts of the Hegelian positions. Marx attacked Hegel's metaphysics by using metaphysical ideas. He made an effort to invert the Hegelian metaphysic, in which history was seen as the place and time for absolute spirit to deploy itself. But Marx was led by the metaphysical concept to comprehend history as the history of the development of technique. According to Axelos, quote, the Marxian vision is an advanced form of magnificent nihilism, a planetary nihilism, and yet in consequence of this, the Marxian vision grasps planetary technique as the one lever that can put the world, this errant star, into motion by abolishing the putrefied world and its, quote, errance, end quote, end quote. Axelos. Axelos argues that the, quote, capitalist technique is not only alienating, it is itself alienated. He asks, quote, is not all making, quote, alienating, end quote? And does making not remain so? Especially when making takes the form of our enormous modern technical machinery, end quote? Axelos. According to Axelos, Marx attacked Hegel not in the name of philosophy or in the name of reason, but, quote, in the name of the will for the realization of praxis, in the name of a practice as a conquering force, end quote. This will for power expressed through the conquering practice finds its ultimate embodiment in technique. Man is rendered capable of conquering the world by virtue of technique. The concept of technique unites Marx's thought and constitutes the center of the Marxian problematic. It is the philosophical core that was included in the Paris manuscripts of 1844 and makes up the seed of Marx's later theoretical elaborations. It is this central point, quote, with its blazing ramifications that becomes thereafter consolidated doctrine, end quote. In this respect, Marx made an effort to abolish metaphysics, but all he managed to do was to, quote, overturn traditional Western metaphysics, end quote, to, quote, reverse Western metaphysics. Consequently, Marx, quote, fulfills modern metaphysics, end quote, by giving a, quote, position of privilege, end quote, to the material world and technical activity. Marx opposed any kind of dualism, but his reduction of the world and world history to the development of technique produced dualism. In this, Marx simply continued the tradition of Western thought as it had been constructed after the dawn of the pre-Socratic tradition. Papaioannou also challenged both orthodox and humanist Marxist readings of Marx's early writings and called for a return to Marx in order to rethink Marxism as philosophy and reinvigorate the Marx-Hegel dialogue. In his attempt to understand Marx's philosophical foundations, Papaioannou rejected the orthodox Marxist problematic as regards the, quote, epistemological break, the split between young and mature Marx. At the same time, however, Papaioannou argued against humanist Marxist approaches to Marx's early writings, arguing that they constructed a, quote, new ideology, a, quote, new humanism, that emanated from the discovery of the young Marx. According to Papaioannou, in his early writings, Marx misconstrued the Hegelian metaphysics of labor and absolutized the concepts of labor and technique. Having been under the influence of Feuerbach, Marx was led to his early, quote, naturalism, humanism, end quote, which was nothing but a limited and contradictory synthesis of Feuerbachian naturalism and Hegelian historicism. In contrast with Hegel, for Marx it is not the state that can reconcile man with his world, but his productive labor. In this point, according to Papaioannou, lies Marx's metaphysics of praxis. It's a practice, parenthesis, praxis, end parenthesis. As Marx has not specifically clarified the meaning of the term, quote, practice. As a consequence, Papaioannou criticized Marx for a conception of praxis that is not constituted in the real world. It is concealed from the development of the productive forces which become independent and determine historical evolution. Marx reduced human praxis to labor activity and industrial practice. This perception of Marx's concept of praxis served as a starting point for Papaioannou's discussion of Marx's theory. In Papaioannou's view, the concept of, quote, productive forces, end quote, constituted the center of Marx's philosophical intuition. The premier dialectic of Marx is pure metaphysics of technique formulated in his proposition, quote, if it is industry, then conceived as the exoteric revelation of man's essential powers, the human essence of nature, or the natural essence of man, can also be understood, end quote, Marx. Papaioannou stressed that in Marx's analysis, industry was reduced to a copula universi, C-O-P-U-L-A U-N-I-V-E-R-S-I. Marx's vision of a progressive unification of cosmos through the development of productive forces takes the form of a veritable pantheism of industry. Only the industrial praxis is capable of abolishing the exteriority of nature in regard to man by achieving the, quote, humanization of nature, end quote, and the, quote, naturalism of man, end quote. In this way, Marx believed that the dualism between man and nature will be transcended. Based on this assumption, Papaioannou pointed out that Marx ended in a, quote, monophysitic anthropology, end quote, that deified labor, but only industrial labor, since the peasantry, their productive activity, and their affiliation with nature belonged to the idiocy of rural life. Papaioannou's critique of Marx's technicism concentrated nearly exclusively on Marx's early writings. According to Papaioannou, after 1847, and basically with the poverty of philosophy, Marx gradually discarded the, quote, metaphysical naivety of his youth, end quote, and, quote, blotted out from his memory this profoundly barbaric philosophy, end quote. Nonetheless, Papaioannou argued that the nihilism of the apocalypse of Marx's early works did not stop having a subterranean influence on Marx's disciples, and connected this part of the young Marx with the, quote, industrialism, end quote, of Marxism. Orthodox Marxists utilized these technicist elements that could be traced in Marx's thought and canceled the more radical elements of Marxist theorizing. In this point lies Papaioannou's difference in relation to Axelos's and Castoriadis' approach to the concept of technique in Marx. For Axelos and Castoriadis, the concept of technique ran through all of Marx's writings and marked his vision of man and history. According to them, Marx's technicism and positivism penetrated his whole work, and they are not limited to his early writings. Castoriadis more precisely argued that Marx's intellectual growth was marked by one central antinomy between two elements, that is, the revolutionary and the positivist elements. Marx's idea of history includes two opposing theories of human emancipation through the development of the productive forces and human emancipation through the class struggle. Initially, Castoriadis saw Marx's early writings as indicative of the revolutionary inspirations of Marx's youth. Later on, however, he claimed that the antinomy between revolutionary and positivist elements could be traced to Marx's early works. According to Castoriadis, the positivist element of Marx's works finally prevailed in the theory and practice of Marxism, and the significance of class struggle was neglected. For Castoriadis, this prevailing positivism represents the, quote, profoundly persistent hold of Marx's contemporary capitalist world on his thought, end quote. Reinforcing this point, Castoriadis argued that Marx is the, quote, founder of a great secular, quote, rationalist, end quote, religion, end quote, in which, quote, is incarnated the last great avatar of the West rationalist myth, end quote. Marx is deeply immersed in capitalist social imaginary significations. According to Castoriadis, the impact of this rationalist capitalist universe upon Marx's thinking had as a result the dominance of his writings of concepts like labor, productive forces, and technique. Hence, it is no coincidence that Marx criticized neither capitalist rationality nor the form of the capitalist technique. Castoriadis attempted to explicate why Marx did not provide a thorough critique of technique and focused his explanation on Marx's idea of history. The influence of capitalist significations and the inversion of Hegelianism led Marx to write a philosophy of history in which technique, that is, the development of productive forces, makes history advance. Marx was drawn to the metaphysics of technique and to idealism since he regarded technical ideas as the decisive factor for historical development. One moment. B. Marx and Western Humanism. Castoriadis, Axelos, and Papaioannou considered Marx as being imbued with the very categories and significations of Western humanism and capitalist culture. Marx's emphasis on the significance of technology determined his vision of history and his analysis of capitalism. He put particular emphasis on the development of the productive forces at the expense of human praxis. He was enslaved by the capitalist significations of progress and objectivist rationalism, and abandoned class struggle. On this fundamental level, they all agree that Marx is a Western rationalist. Hence, the three Greeks went a little further and situated Marx within the Western philosophical and humanist tradition. Thus, Marx was criticized for being a genuine representative of Western humanism. In Papaioannou's view, for the first time after Plato, Hegel made an endeavor to compose and integrate a variety of experiences such as different and opposite elements into his, quote, system. He not only limited the, quote, casual and the, quote, arbitrary within his system, but he also strengthened its cohesion. He called, quote, recollection Erinnerung, the way in which he attempted to understand and assimilate the world, and for him, recollection is the recollection of the historical elements. Hence, Hegel's intention was to show that man will be unable to get familiar with his essence, to complete, complement, and finish his essence unless he makes it through the work of history. In this way, quote, the Hegelian recollection reflects the Western historical, radically Christian eschatological concept of man, end quote. Unlike Hegel, for Plato, the essence of human existence was regarded as given in advance within a superhistorical mythical past, and the Platonic recollection expresses not only the timeless character of Greek ontology, but also the non-historical character of Greek humanism. And according to Papaioannou, this opposition between the Hegelian and Platonic concepts of recollection could be seen as the basis for a distinction between Western historical and ancient Greek humanism. The Hegelian Erinnerung does not reveal to man what he really is, but reveals what he really becomes. That is, his historicity. Man makes his own history no more within a cycle and perpetually recurring time, but within a new temporality, a linear time in which the future and not the present becomes dominant and prevails within an eschatological time. And if for the ancient Greeks man's route in the human follows the cyclical rotation of the stars and the being of human beings remains always unchangeable, in Hegel man is always presented as a future being, as an inscrutable and problematic being who will learn what he really is if only in the fullness of time, and who will stop being enigmatic for himself only at the end of history. For Plato, the recollection raises man to a superhistorical truth, while for Hegel such a superhistorical absolute truth appears only at the end of history and as a result of history. Until then, the recollection could be nothing more than the historical consciousness, the acknowledgement of history as the only actuality for man. Papaioannou argued that both Hegel and Marx are characterized by a similar perception of historical truth, according to which each historical truth is incomplete and partial. Consequently, they both build up the expectations for an absolute and complete truth. Such a perception of truth, as Papaioannou believes, derives directly from Christianity. It is inconceivable for pre-Christian civilizations. As St. Paul put it, quote, as for knowledge, it will come to an end, for we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. For now we see in a mirror, dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. End quote. St. Paul. According to Papaioannou, both Hegel and Marx could have easily adopted St. Paul's phrase, quote, for now we see in a mirror dimly, end quote, since they were both characterized by the expectation of the advent of the perfect. Hegel maintained that we will be able to know the absolute truth only at the end of history, while Marx asserted that insofar as history continues, which he called prehistory, man is a riddle for himself, and this riddle solution will be given by the future of communism. On this basis, the Hegelian idea of history as the progressive realization of human freedom, with its pan-rational optimism with the dialectics with which it presented the existence of an internal order within the human history and its projection of history as the only substantially human dimension of existence, was nothing more than the entelecheian realization of the anthropocentric declarations of the Renaissance. Papaioannou highlighted the distinction between Greek and Western humanism and argued that in opposition to Greek perceptions of the cosmos, the Western humanist approach conceived of the natural world as an object of scientific domination and technical exploitation. As Papaioannou put it, quote, nature ceased to be a value and became instead an object of domination, deprived of ethical significance, end quote. In regard to knowledge, to the Greeks, quote, knowledge was, quote, virtue, end quote, because its objects, the cosmos, was the ethical model par excellence, end quote. While for the West, and more specifically for Francis Bacon, knowledge was power. For Western humanism, knowledge ceased to be a virtue, quote, a passive contemplation of the cosmos and an affirmation of our affinity with it. Instead, knowledge became power, a promulgation of the, quote, reign of man, a violent interrogation of nature, an affirmation of the utter sovereignty of the subject who apprehends it in order to subjugate it, end quote. Papaioannou. According to Papaioannou, Marlowe, quote, has expressed this reversal of values with explosive force, quote, to have aspiring minds, end quote, end quote. Thus, quote, the will to power becomes the essence of being, end quote, and, quote, these men, quote, that much do want, end quote, of whom Shakespeare speaks in Timon of Athens, end quote, become, quote, the ultimate measure of things, end quote. By the same token, Marx praised the bourgeoisie for creating a world market, a world history, and for drawing, quote, even the most barbarian nations into civilization, end quote. The bourgeoisie made, quote, barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized countries, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West, end quote. For Papaioannou, Marx showed contempt for the Asian civilizations and had an exclusively Eurocentric perception of world history. Even his hostility to Russia and his Slavophobia could be seen as part of his views regarding the West's superiority to the East. Axelos also drew a distinction between ancient Greek and modern European thought. In Greek thought, quote, the world remains one, end quote. Physis is totality and is distinguished from the Western meaning of the word, quote, nature. Man, quote, obeys a cosmic rhythm, quote, is a being of physis, and, quote, he does not set himself up as master of the cosmos. His works do not try to move beyond his own order, end quote. In modern thought, the world is divided into nature and spirit, reality and idea. Man's will is, quote, to know it, enrich it, explain it, and transform it, end quote. By the means of technique, man is struggling against nature. He, quote, works and toils at building objects, end quote. In this context, Axelos made the claim that Marx took up and perpetuated the Western tradition, quote, with its basis in the human ego as agent, that is, in the will and its power, end quote. Greek thought is deprived of any historical horizon, and the idea of progress remained unknown. On the other hand, as a prominent figure of Western thought, Marx grasped nature as an object of technical exploitation and espoused the conception of history as a linear and progressive process. On this basis, it is no coincidence that in Marx's analysis, quote, the dialectic of Western history is built up as the dialectic of universal history, end quote. Marx's, quote, Western and, quote, European schema and idea of history reflect a Christianic eschatological concept of man. I think eschatology means like the final questions about the final end point of things. So I think like Christian eschatology is about like, I don't know, the apocalypse or something like that. Does Marx's, quote, Western and, quote, European schema include, quote, the totality, both spatial and temporal, of the becoming of mankind in history, end quote? And Axelos asks further, quote, Was it always and everywhere the forces of production that instigated social changes? End quote. Marx had no concern to know whether his historical materialism is, quote, applicable to any culture whatever, or for the, quote, riddles posed by Indian or Chinese history, end quote. Thus, quote, Occidentalism becomes universal, end quote. And Marx's reading of the world is particular and one-sided. Like Papaioannou and Axelos, Castoriadis also saw Marx's thought as derivative of Western humanism. Castoriadis perceived Marx's stress on technique and the primacy of the economic element as an expression of a world whose foundation could be traced to the beginning of modernity. The end of the Middle Ages signified for Western Europe a period of great transformation that modified man's notions pertaining to actual function of knowledge, the role of nature, and the meaning of man's life. Grotius succinctly expressed this formulated relationship between man, knowledge, and nature. Quote, Almighty God at the creation and again after the deluge give to mankind in general a domination over things of this inferior world, end quote. The Greeks perceived nature, cosmos, the motions of the stellar bodies as the measure of all things, the manifestation of a reasonable, harmonious order, the materialization of beauty and order. Western humanism reduced nature to a mere object that had to be subjugated, conquered, and exploited. Marx espoused certain aspects of this perspective and grasped nature only as an object of technical exploitation, and man as a carrier of power exercised over nature. Marx's emphasis on the primacy of industry, technique, and productive forces reduced man to his productive activity and chimed with the Hegelian metaphysics of labor. Marx created a new ontology of labor under the influence of the Hegelian nature of labor. Yet he pushed the Hegelian premise to its extreme by reducing the essence of man into his labor activity, and technique as the incarnation and unfolding of this new Western rationality. In his article, quote, Value, Equality, Justice, Politics, from Marx to Aristotle and from Aristotle to Ourselves, Castoriadis argued that Marx was imbued with capitalist significations and deeply immersed in the capitalist imaginary significations, and he claimed that, quote, the first chapter of Capital is metaphysical, end quote. Sounds like something Althusser would say, if you ask me. But what do I know? Castoriadis re-examined Marx's critique of Aristotle and Capital and found it ambiguous and fallacious. Marx criticized Aristotle, quote, as though the latter had wanted to create a theory of the economy and even of the capitalist economy, end quote. For Castoriadis, Marx was led to a historical reductionism and attempted to explicate the past by using imaginary social significations that could operate, quote, in and by way of capitalist society, end quote. The Marxian theorizing is antinomic and divided between the position that social, economic, and intellectual categories are historically constructed and determined, and the conviction that history itself has its own objective logic, which is unfolding according to an inevitable and automatic rationality, that thus producing social categories that are eternal and ahistorical. Marx absolutized the peculiar conditions of capitalist society and reduced capitalist significations into a, quote, universal and transhistoric determination, end quote. This resulted in discussing Aristotle by using the creations and institutions of capitalism, and it fails to take into account the fact that they are historically produced. In doing so, Marx privileges and ontologizes the Western European social and historical experience. As Axelos could ask in order to reinforce Castoriadis' point, quote, has not Marx once again projected and generalized the truth of the reality of one historical epoch, which is tending to become universal, upon the whole of history, end quote. Castoriadis and Marx, or Section 2, Castoriadis and Marx. Papaioannou and Axelos recognized the need to read Hegel and Marx in unity and emphasized their interconnection. The reconstruction of the Hegel-Marx dialogue brought out the Hegelian concepts that appear to have permeated the whole of Marx's writings. It also revealed the centrality of the concept of alienation and the perspective in terms of which Marx viewed and used this account. Axelos and Papaioannou treated the concept of alienation as a central critical category which arose from their reading of Hegel and Marx as a unity. According to Axelos, Marx's theorizing aimed at concreteness and freedom from mystification, end quote, concerned with confrontation of the thinking of Hegel, Smith, and Ricardo, not in order to simply provide, quote, a better history of philosophy and philosophy of history, or a better systematic and historical exposition of political economy, but in order to introduce philosophical and historical criticism into philosophy and economy, end quote. In a parallel way, Papaioannou argued that the concept of, quote, fetishism, as articulated by Marx in Capital, expresses the essence of human and economic alienation. The social relations between individual workers appear as relations between material objects. The, quote, definite social relation between men themselves, end quote, takes the, quote, fantastic form of relation between things, end quote. Castoriadis also made perceptive comments about the issues of fetishism and reification as they were articulated in Marx's thought. Yet while Papaioannou and Axelos saw Marx's thought as a philosophical and historical critique, a critique of philosophy and political economy, from another vantage point, Castoriadis speaks of Marx's economic theory and attempts to pinpoint the reasons for the failure of Marx's economic analysis of capitalism. For Castoriadis, Marx attached extreme importance to the economy, and his premises concerning the contradictions and the crises of the capitalist economy seemed to disregard the action of social classes and overlook the spontaneous trends of society and the economy. Castoriadis takes the stance that this theorizing of society and the economy emanates from Marx's fundamental theoretical principle. In his attempt to interpret Marx's analysis of fetishism, Castoriadis pointed out that, quote, in the capitalist economy, individuals, whether proletarians or capitalists, are actually and wholly transformed into things, i.e. reified. They are submitted to the action of economic laws that differ in no way from natural laws, except that they use the, quote, conscious actions of individuals as the unconscious instrument of their realization, end quote. Castoriadis. Writing about Marx's conception of a correspondence between economic and physical laws, Castoriadis refers here, among other things, to Marx's statement in Capital that, quote, the development of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, end quote. Above all, however, with his aforementioned quotation, Castoriadis appears to be critical of Marx's concept of fetishism, which is regarded as, quote, an abstraction that corresponds with only half of reality, and as such it is ultimately false, end quote. For Castoriadis, reification cannot be total, and the workers in capitalism are by no means fully reified and completely alienated. On this issue, but following a different reasoning, Axelos founded his critique of Marx's analysis of alienation on the following premise, end quote. Quote, not end quote, quote. The difficult thing to get hold of in Marx's analysis of human alienation is the nature of this entity, man, who alienates himself. For alienation to exist, someone or something must get alienated. One can ask, just what is the human essence that becomes alienated, since they have never yet been men who were not alienated? End quote. Axelos. At the center of Axelos's critique of Marx lies the position that Marx, who had fiercely criticized and rejected all economic and philosophical presuppositions, did not worry at all, quote, about his own metaphysical presuppositions, end quote. Hence, in order to criticize Marx, Axelos asks, has there ever been a non-alienated man? Is there a human nature, a pure human essence that becomes alienated? Has there ever existed a non-alienated human essence that makes it possible to perceive this transition to an alienated condition? On this criterion, Marx was criticized for being, quote, metaphysical and based on, quote, presuppositions. To put it differently, according to Axelos, Marx presupposed a, quote, being or a reality that, quote, precedes the externalization and the alienation, end quote. For Axelos, Marx presupposes a, quote, true, real species man that he uses as the measure of alienation, end quote. And this, quote, presupposition is a highly, quote, metaphysical idea. It precedes and transcends all sensuous, objective, real, empirical, natural, social, etc. experience. It is with this metaphysical and anthropological historical idea that Marx attacks other metaphysical conceptions of man, indeed any metaphysical conception of man, especially that of Hegel, end quote. Axelos, Kostas Axelos. Castoriadis and Axelos' reading of the concept of alienation in Marx is being deployed from a similar perspective. They both conceive of the Marxian notion of alienation as it is used by orthodox Marxism, that is, as being a closed category and established and static fact. On the other hand, the peculiarity in Castoriadis' approach lies in the fact that it supplies us with a dialectical and processual interpretation of the ideas of alienation as process, as a continuous struggle which, however, bears similarities with analogous developments of Marxist thought provided by critical Marxism. Helmut Reichelt, who's I think I have some Reichelt essays on my on this YouTube channel. If not, I definitely have one that I'm waiting to upload that I have stored away in the bank. Anyway, Helmut Reichelt, for example, has argued that, quote, reality as an inverted world consists of the unity of two contradictory movements. Conceptions that are premised on the idea of being as stasis fail here. Reality is a being that can only be grasped as a dynamic process, end quote. In this way, there is not a non-alienated state, but a process, a constant struggle between alienation and non-alienation. As John Holloway has characteristically pointed out, the concept, quote, the concept of alienation or fetishism, in other words, implies its opposite, not as essential non-alienated, quote, home deep in our hearts, but as resistance, refusal, rejection of alienation in our daily practice. It is only on the basis of a concept of anti-alienation or anti-fetishism that we can conceive of alienation or fetishism. If fetishism and anti-fetishism coexist, then it can only be as antagonistic processes. Fetishism is a process of fetishization, a process of separating subject and object, always in antagonism to the opposing movement of anti-fetishism, the struggle to reunite subject and object. End quote. John Holloway. Similarly, in a manner that is closer to critical Marxism than Castoriadis himself realized, for Castoriadis, the incomplete reification and the fact that the people in capitalism have been alienated go hand in hand with their struggle against this reification, against their reduction into objects. Yet this imperfect reification constitutes the driving force and of the same time indicates the fragility, the vulnerability, and the ultimate contradiction of capitalism. Therefore, this struggle in and against reification is the decisive characteristic of capitalist society and not the action of economic laws which could lead capitalism to an unavoidable collapse. According to Castoriadis, Marx put particular emphasis on the economic laws that guide capitalist economy at the expense of human praxis, resistance, and subjectivity. Marx was enslaved by the capitalist significations of progress and objectivist rationalism, and abandoned class struggle. For this reason, Marx's views concerning, quote, labor, quote, industry, quote, technique, and, quote, productive forces determined his theory of history and provided a sound basis for his philosophy of history and his analysis of capitalism. Marx made an endeavor to comprehend world history and simultaneously to formulate his theory regarding emancipation. However, Castoriadis argued that one could find in Marx's theory of human emancipation two elements which are diametrically opposed: a revolutionary element that stressed class struggle and workers' self-organization, and a positivist and deterministic element which perceived social development as a natural process and contributed to the naturalization of history. The positivist element finally became dominant in Marx and Marxism, and Marx's theory developed into the form of a closed system. Castoriadis' key claim is that Marx's thesis in Capital is premised upon the position that capitalism is progressing by force of the unfolding of its own economic laws and under the impact of an abstractly conceived historical and technological development. In Marx's analysis of capitalism, class struggle is disregarded and omitted. Castoriadis takes his argument a step further in his essay Modern Capitalism and Revolution. Here, Castoriadis wrote that having been under the influence of capitalist ideology, Marx developed in Capital a, quote, economic system, end quote, which, quote, does not account for the functioning and evolution of capitalism, end quote. Castoriadis argued that he used to consider the development of Marx's thought as a progressive shift from his early more radical and revolutionary inspirations to the formation of a complete theoretical system, a closed and finished theory. However, Castoriadis now recognized that the two antinomic elements of Marx's thought, that is, the revolutionary and the positivist elements, both subsist in Marx's very early works. For Castoriadis, Hegel's account regarding the move and adventure of spirit turned out to be in Marx the constant advance of the productive forces and the evolutionary substitution of different social classes which define the several stages of this development. Similarly, Papaioannou ascribed Marx's, quote, grandiose vision, end quote, to reconcile, quote, the Apollonianism of progress with the Dionysianism of purifying revolution, end quote, to his Hegelian influences. Papaioannou argued that Marx and Hegel espoused a similar perception of history. History is always for both of them the progressive march towards human emancipation, the continuous unfolding of man's autonomy and freedom. This line led Marx to identify the progressive realization of freedom with the development of the productive forces and its subsequent impact on the social and economic struggles. It is this latter point that provides the basis of Castoriadis' critique of Marx. Marx and Engels opined in the German ideology that, quote, people won freedom for themselves each time to the extent that was dictated and permitted not by their ideal of man, but by the existing productive forces, end quote. It is neither the goodwill of man nor his ideas which could lead to the elimination of capitalist poverty, but the, quote, existing productive forces, end quote, and their constant development. Castoriadis emphasized Marx's position in Capital, according to which the, quote, development of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, end quote. And for this reason, quote, even when a society has begun to track down the natural laws of its movement, and it is the ultimate aim of this work to reveal the economic laws of motion of society, it can neither leap over the natural phases of its development nor remove those natural phases by decree, but it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs, end quote. For Marx, therefore, the historical necessity of the collapse of capitalism, I guess that was a Marx quote. Actually, I'm not sure if that's Marx. I think it's Castoriadis, actually. Hold on. I don't know. I'm not sure. Anyway, for Marx, therefore, the historical necessity of the collapse of capitalism was reduced to natural necessity. And in Marx's words, quote, capitalist production begets with the inexorability of a natural process its own negation, end quote. Reinforcing his point, Castoriadis quoted Marx's standpoint regarding the description of his method provided by the European messenger of St. Petersburg. Marx called this critical presentation of his, quote, own method, quote, generous. Incidentally, this, quote, generous description of Marx's method mentioned, among other things, that, quote, Marx treated the social movement as a process of natural history, governed by laws not only independent of human will, consciousness, and intelligence, but rather, on the contrary, determining that will, consciousness, and intelligence, end quote. Therefore, as Castoriadis argued, Marx's economic determinism was developed, quote, in the form of a system, end quote. Marx saw history as a, quote, rational system ruled by given laws, end quote. In this line of thought, the development of the productive forces is, quote, progress, and, quote, commands the rest in social life, end quote. The fetishist conviction regarding the natural laws that rule and explain the historical movement of society, and the certainty about the natural necessity of the socialist revolution, accelerated fatalist and reformist attitudes within the orthodox Marxist parties. Fatalism and reformism were coupled with technocratic positions that promoted the specialists and technicians of rationality. Following this kind of argumentation, Castoriadis is concerned with the issue of technique, which constituted one of the key elements of his critique of Marx. Castoriadis' thesis could be epitomized by what he said in an interview given to the Italian journal Metropoli on the 30th of November 1978. Castoriadis argued that Marx remained enslaved by capitalist social imaginary significations and was trammeled by his positions regarding the centrality of the concepts of economy and the, quote, development of productive forces, end quote. Marx found nothing reprehensible in regard to the pseudo, quote, rationality of the capitalist technique in the organization of capitalist production. Castoriadis dealt insistently with the idea of autonomy and the self-management of the working class, and he questioned the capitalist technique and the capitalist technique's treatment by Marx and Marxists. While Marx fiercely criticized the inhuman conditions in capitalist factories, he did not condemn the organization of capitalist factories, the implied rationality in the form of technique. In other words, he took technique for granted as something not likely to change and sought human freedom beyond the necessity of labor. As Castoriadis remarked, however, quote, contemporary technique is well and truly capitalist. There is nothing neutral about it, end quote. Castoriadis attempted to explicate why Marx did not provide a thorough critique of technique and focused his explanation on Marx's idea of history. The conclusions he drew were extremely critical of the role that Marx and Marxism could play in the establishment of an autonomous and self-governing society. Quote, Marx did and could not develop such a critique of technique. The reason is profoundly bound to his conception of history, like the Hegelian reason or spirit of the world. In Marx, it is the, quote, rationality, end quote, incarnated by technique, the, quote, development of productive forces, end quote, which makes history advance. This explains why Marx and Marxism could only be massive obstacles to a movement aiming at self-management, autonomy, self-government, end quote. Castoriadis did not intend to overlook the great significance of Marx's theorizing regarding the study of society by making use of the concepts of labor organization, of production and social divisions, but rather, Castoriadis rejected the idea of reducing human practical and productive activity to technique, which is following an independent course that determines at the same time social life and organization. Technique is neither autonomous nor advancing and separate from social relations and conflicts. On the other hand, technique must not be seen as a determinant for the social development and characterization of a social system. Throughout the earlier phases of human history, the development of technique was characterized by a relative stagnation and a, quote, great variety of cultures, both archaic and historical, e.g. Asiatic cultures built on the, quote, same technical bases, end quote, end quote. Castoriadis proceeded to consider the genesis of the concept of technique by examining the origins and the use of the term in Greek antiquity. Castoriadis' discussion pinpointed the affinity of the Greek techne with the Western concept of technique, and at the same time he highlighted what differentiated the two. Castoriadis noted that the Western and modern technique, quote, is separated from creation, end quote, and added that, quote, it is separated, too, from questions about what is thus produced and for what, end quote. Taking his argument a step further, he connected the Western, quote, vulgar notion of technique, quote, as a neutral and ancillary instrument with Marx's use of the concept of end quote, with Marx's use of the concept of technique. One second. Like Papaioannou and Axelos, Castoriadis argued that having been under the influence of Hegel, Marx perceived the creation of man as his self-engendering through labor, and gradually he restricted this creation by identifying it with technical creation. Marx not only, quote, steps unwisely across the threshold of physis, end quote, and conceives of man as the being who wants to, quote, overcome, dominate, and shape the forces of nature, end quote, but also considers that, quote, technique is creation insofar as it is the unfolding of rationality, end quote. Hence, history obtains its progressive character through this, quote, unfolding of rationality, end quote. And technique acts as a mediator between nature and human needs. As a result, for Marx, technique is not only neutral, it is positive and performs an expression of ratio as well. As Castoriadis put it, quote, Marx calls in question neither the objects nor the means of capitalist production, being concerned instead with the way in which both are appropriated, and with capitalism's diversion of the efficiency of technique, which is itself seen as irreproachable, to the profit of a particular class. Technique here has become not just, quote, neutral, but positive in all its aspects. Technique has become operative reason, and men need only and must only regain control of technique's operations, end quote. Castoriadis. From Castoriadis' vantage point, technique, the technical object or ensemble, quote, is itself a product, end quote, and its construction, quote, brings into play the whole social existence of the collectivity which gives birth to it, its organization of the world, end quote. Modern technology expresses the culture of the capitalist world. It is its language. Capitalist technique and capitalist economy cannot be grasped separately. However, Marx in Capital, quote, takes as given a technique whose development is autonomous, end quote. And accordingly, quote, the sources of this technique and of its capacity for development are not really gone into. Neither is the question of the choice between several techniques, end quote. Marx makes the same mistake as academic political economy did. He presupposed, posited as, quote, given, the, quote, state of technique. And for him, the fundamental issue is not, quote, the state of technique, but technique's ceaseless development, end quote. Castoriadis. Castoriadis went on to develop his critique of Marx by associating the issue of technology with the class struggle. He argued that the dynamic of technical evolution in capitalism is, quote, increasingly influenced by the development of the proletariat and the class struggle within capitalism, end quote. According to Monica Reinfelder, he argued that the dynamic of technological evolution in capitalism is, quote, increasingly influenced by the development of the proletariat and the class struggle within capitalism, end quote. According to Monica Reinfelder, what distinguishes Castoriadis from other scholars, such as Bettelheim, is his position that, quote, the class struggle does not simply, quote, intervene, end quote, in the transition from one mode of production to another, but actually determines the development within the mode of production, end quote. Monica Reinfelder. Indeed, Castoriadis pointed out that both academic political economy and Marxist analysis seem to obscure, quote, the most important factor, social conflict in proportion. Bracket. There's a problem here with the English translation. It is, quote, production instead of, quote, proportion. Class struggle within the enterprise, end quote. Castoriadis. Capitalists seek the automation of production in order to eliminate the human role in the process so as to, quote, depend not on men but on machines, end quote. End quote, for every, quote, need, for every productive process, end quote. They develop, quote, not one object or technique, but a vast range of objects and techniques, end quote. Hence, by quoting the example of the Luddites and the English dockers, Castoriadis argued that, quote, the putting into concrete effect of this technology, the selection from this range of the technique to be applied under given circumstances, is both an instrument of class struggle and among the stakes of that struggle, whose outcome on each occasion determines the appearance and disappearance of professions, the flourishing or decline of entire regions. The struggle's outcome depends on circumstances as a whole, and its effects can be unexpected, end quote. Castoriadis. For Castoriadis, Marx's use of the concept of technique led him to, quote, a metaphysics of technique, end quote, contrary to his intentions to idealism. Marx, who fiercely opposed any views that regarded abstractions and ideas as constituting the, quote, moving forces of history, returned to idealism by considering, quote, technical ideas, end quote, as determinants of historical development. The issue of technology was always presented in the debates within the Marxist tradition. Linked to this were the notions of, quote, labor, quote, industry, quote, factory schooling, quote, productive forces, quote, economic determinism, quote, evolutionist historical development, quote, modes of production, and, quote, teleology of technology, end quote. All of these concepts have been the subject of fierce controversy within the ranks of both orthodox and critical Marxists. Nevertheless, even the critical Marxists attributed to Engels the, quote, technicist distortion of Marx. Castoriadis endeavored to trace the origins of the technicism that undermined the radical and liberating meaning of Marxism and distorted the objective of the labor movement back to Marx's own writings. The question of technique occupied a prominent place in Castoriadis' critique of Marx. Castoriadis attacked Marx's technicism, considering Marx's technicism to be responsible for the positivist and deterministic elements of his theory. Marx was trapped in his conception of technique and imbued with the very categories of significations of Western humanism and capitalist culture. Marx's emphasis on the significance of technology determined his vision of history and his analysis of capitalism. Castoriadis saw the connection between Marx's technicism and the technological determinism of orthodox Marxism. Kautsky, Lenin, and Stalin did nothing more than extend Marx's technicism to that technicism's extreme limits. Section 3. The limits of Castoriadis' critique. Axelos, Castoriadis, and Papaioannou were not only connected by common central issues in terms of developing their critique of Marx, but also shared similarities in the limitations of their approaches. The Greek scholars' reading of Marx was inextricably tied up with and rooted in their experience of traditional Marxism in both Greece and France. Castoriadis, Axelos, Papaioannou had a very strong flavor of orthodox, dogmatic, mechanistic Marxism of the Greek communist movement. Especially for Castoriadis, who as a Trotskyist ran the risk of being arrested and murdered by the Greek Stalinists, this experience caused obsessions or traumas which proved to be crucial in forming the ground of his critique of Marx. Arriving in France, they had to deal with the dominance of the Stalinist intellectuals and the influence of the French Communist Party. Castoriadis also faced the theoretical and political inadequacy of French Trotskyism. This part of the French intellectual and political setting was in some ways a continuation of the experience of orthodox Marxism that they had in Greece. For all of their differences, one key limitation with the Greek scholars which the Greek scholars have in common is that they did not manage to get away from the experience of orthodox Marxism, to liberate themselves from the shadow of traditional Marxism. In many cases, their reading of Marx was overshadowed by it. They read Marx without drawing a distinction between Marx and orthodox Marxism. Hence, they identified Marx with traditional Marxist interpretations and came to the point of reading Marx through the prism of orthodox Marxism. As a consequence, their interpretation of Marx was done through the classical formulation used by traditional Marxism to interpret Marx. That is, through the base superstructure scheme. All of them read Marx through the, quote, famous passage from Marx's preface to a contribution to a critique of political economy of 1859, according to which the economic structure of society determines the political structure. Marx's thought was seen as reinforcing a split between the subject and object, between struggle and objective laws of the development of society, and the objective laws of development of society, between subjectivity and structure, between economics and politics. This traditional analysis of Marx determined the questions that they asked and led to significant consequences as regards their evaluation of Marx's antinomies and limitations. For Axelos, quote, there is a dogmatic element in Marx's thought itself, the closure of many questions, end quote. But how successfully can someone uncover Marx's dogmatism by using a, quote, dogmatic reading, end quote, of Marx? How could one criticize Marx's presuppositions by presupposing and espousing a, quote, orthodox reading of Marx? Similarly, Castoriadis failed or refused to recognize that the base superstructure model is just a, quote, simple popularization, a, quote, popularistic simplification of Marx's theorizing, emphasized and misused by the traditional Marxist currents over the last century. Castoriadis developed his critique of Marx and dealt with the question of technique through the base superstructure metaphor. He struggled against orthodox Marxism, but he espoused its analytical framework and perspective. when he developed his critique on Marx. In this respect, Monica Reinfelter has rightly pointed out that, quote, while Castoriadis thus repudiates what the technicists uphold, he nonetheless stands on common ground with them as regards the content and location of Marx's, quote, message. While mocking the vulgarizers for ignoring the cornerstone of Marx's theory, namely capital, Castoriadis himself shows a marked tendency to rely on the 1859 preface, so popular with them. When he does turn to capital, it is to copy out passages reaffirming the, quote, dialectic of history, rather than to study Marx's analysis of, quote, machinery and large-scale industry. This failure, too, Castoriadis shares with the, quote, orthodoxy he so despises, end quote. Monica Reinfelter. Indeed, what Castoriadis appears to be arguing is that Marx never questioned the pseudo-rationality of the capitalist technique. He did not realize that there is no autonomy, no neutrality of the capitalist technique. As a result, he presupposed the state of technique and its perpetual development. However, Marx very emphatically argued in Capital, just to give an example, that the, quote, automation and instrument of labor confronts the worker during the labor process in the shape of capital, dead labor which dominates and soaks up living labor power, end quote. Marx made clear that, quote, the automation itself is the subject and the workers are merely conscious organs, coordinated with the unconscious organs of the automation, and together with the latter subordinated to the central moving force, end quote. But Castoriadis, as Raniero Pansieri has argued, is more interested in expressing his, quote, polemical opposition to Marxism, end quote, and does not want just to liberate Marx from the economistic or the technicist interpretations of orthodox Marxism. Seen through the prism of orthodox approaches, Marx was found to have neglected class struggle, and his writings were seen as promoting, quote, scientific analysis and promoting objective historical necessity. According to Castoriadis, Marx failed to recognize that the class struggle determines the development of technique. For Castoriadis, Marx maintained that, quote, capitalism evolves solely in terms of the effects of the economic laws it contains, end quote. And consequently, quote, class struggle nowadays comes into it, end quote. In an attempt to reinforce his point, Castoriadis maintained that there is, quote, a more nuanced and more subtle Marxism, end quote, that, quote, affirms that the class struggle plays an important role, end quote. In opposition to Marx, he remained obsessed with the study of economic laws of capitalism and abandoned class struggle. Assuming this to be the case, Castoriadis criticized this kind of Marxism for situating class struggle, quote, within a given framework which marks out its limits and defines its meaning, end quote. Castoriadis' passion to prove Marx's positivism reached the point of arguing that compared with the, quote, scientific, end quote, objective approach taken by Marx, structuralist Marxism called attention to the importance of the class struggle, though within a structurally determined framework of capitalist development. While Castoriadis rightly pointed out that the limited and confined role that the class struggle played in Althusser's and Poulantzas's thought, his approach to Marx's conception of class struggle was based on a misunderstanding and led Castoriadis to misinterpretations that had great theoretical and political implications. Marx is understood as a, quote, scientist whose main purpose was to study the objective trends of capitalist development and discover the objective laws of motion of history. Without drawing a clear distinction between Marx and traditional Marxism, Castoriadis noted that within Marxism, class struggle always remained of secondary importance. It is not clearly separated from economic determinism. Hence, Castoriadis came to conclude that, quote, Marx, who discovered class struggle, wrote a monumental work analyzing the development of capitalism from which the class struggle is totally absent, end quote. In opposition to Castoriadis' claim, however, Marx emphatically wrote in his letter to Joseph Weidemeyer, quote, I do not claim to have discovered either the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them, end quote. For Castoriadis, Marx simply believed that economic laws govern capitalism, and all he did was to formulate these laws. Class struggle affects the historical evolution unconsciously, and it is limited by the, quote, state of the technical economic infrastructure, end quote. For Marxism, classes have no conscious and separate role, and they are, quote, simply the instrument in which the action of the productive forces is embodied, end quote. Thus, Castoriadis concluded that in Marxism there is, quote, a triumph of determinism over class struggle, end quote. Castoriadis proceeded to evaluate Marx's thought not on the basis of its total content, and this is the case for Axelos and Papaioannou too, who to a large extent tended to focus their attention on Marx's early writings, and even then did so very selectively. The Greek scholar's critique emphasizes some parts and fails to examine Marx's work as a whole. The assessment of Marx's concepts is not understood and located within the whole of his writings. Castoriadis intentionally overlooks the primacy that Marx attributed to class struggle in his earlier works and fails to see that in Capital there is, quote, a shift of attention from class struggle in general to the specific form taken by class struggle in capitalist society, end quote. Castoriadis focused more on the economic interpretation of Marx's critique of economic categories. His treatment of capital seems lacking in depth, given that he reads it as an economic text that seeks to investigate the objective laws of capitalist society. Castoriadis accepts the economic categories in Capital uncritically. That is to say, he does not see commodity, value, money, capital, wage, and so forth as forms that are socially constituted, deriving from antagonistic human social relations. These categories are of social conflict, of struggle, even when Marx himself failed or omitted to emphasize the working class struggles. As Holloway put it, quote, working class struggle is not the explicit object of the analysis in Capital, but it is implicit in every category, end quote. As a result, Castoriadis fails to perceive that, quote, capital is a formal analysis of struggle in capitalist society, an analysis of the forms taken by the antagonistic social relations, end quote. Castoriadis grasped these categories as being deprived of the class antagonism and not related to the class struggle, reproducing in this manner the traditional Marxist interpretations that he was forcefully opposed to. More to the point, Castoriadis repeatedly refers to Marx's naturalization of history and his emphasis on the economic laws of capitalism at the expense of class struggle. Castoriadis over and over again quotes Marx's words in the preface to the first edition of Capital. Marx argued there that, quote, it is the ultimate aim of this work to reveal the economic law of motion of modern society, end quote. I think it's supposed to be laws, but maybe I'm wrong. And that, quote, the development of the economic formation of society is viewed as a process of natural history, end quote. Castoriadis pointed out that Marx's economic determinism was developed, quote, in the form of a system, end quote. Marx saw history as a, quote, rational system ruled by given laws, end quote. In this line of thought, the development of the productive forces is seen as, quote, progress, that, quote, commands the rest in social life, end quote. Indeed, the Second and Third International naturalized the capitalist economic categories and deified an objective developmental logic. Once again, Castoriadis pushed some of Marx's unfortunate and problematic formulations to the extreme. He not only neglected the critical Marxist accounts on this issue, but also failed to interpret the, quote, laws, as Marx called them, of capitalist society as a product of class struggle between capital and labor, as forms through and in which class conflict subsists. Marx's analysis of the imposition of the commodity form and the creation of a normal working day constitutes a very clear manifestation of what Marx meant when he talked about those, quote, laws of capitalism. He comprehends the laws that legalize and exercise control over the length and structure of the working day as the outcome of a fierce struggle between labor and capital. Quote, these legal and minutiae were not at all the products of parliamentary fancy. They developed gradually out of circumstances as natural laws of the modern mode of production. Their formulation, official recognition, and proclamation by the state were the result of a long struggle of classes. End quote. Marx. The consequence of viewing, quote, the economic laws of motion in modern society, end quote, in this way contradicts the naturalization of both history and capitalist economic categories. It regards history as the making of people's will and not as the result of objective social and historical laws. As Cleaver aptly argues, these, quote, natural laws, end quote, are, quote, hardly the metaphysical unexplained regularities usually evoked by traditional Marxists. The, quote, laws of motion, end quote, of capitalist society are the direct product of the class struggle, and denote only what capital has had the strength to impose given the rising power of the working class. They occur, quote, behind the backs, end quote, of the actor, only in the way they are the unforeseeable outcome of the confrontation of the two classes' power, end quote. Harry Cleaver. Quote, laws do not exist separately from the class confrontation, nor do they act independently of human actions from the antagonism of class struggle. Nor does this class struggle derive from presupposed structural mechanisms. It does not take place within a given framework of enduring structures and laws. The laws of social reproduction express the social and historical specificity of the movement of class struggle in capitalism. They are neither objective nor transhistorical regularities, but rather transient categories that are always in motion. On this issue, and in contradistinction to Castoriadis, Papaioannou argue that Marx reproached bourgeois political economy for, quote, fetishism. That is to say, for considering, quote, things as creations external to human activity, while in fact they are the products of human practice. One could criticize Marx's thought for its own insufficiencies, but it is impossible to claim that, quote, production relations or, quote, economic laws in the thought of Marx constituted an objectivity external to human activity. For Papaioannou, Marx's phrase in the preface of Capital, as well as in some isolated passages of his writings regarding the, quote, economic laws, and the naturalization of history do not represent Marx's thinking, but rather betray his sociological thought. It is this latter point made by Papaioannou regarding the sociological thought of Marx that constituted another common limitation that the three Greek scholars shared in reference to their reading of Marx. Indeed, what they all had in common is that Marx's work was seen as divided into its economic, philosophical, political, and sociological parts. Seen in this light, such an approach led them, despite claims to the opposite, to endorse in their analysis of Marx the distinction made by the traditional Marxist tradition between Marxist economics, Marxist philosophy, Marxist sociology, and Marxist political science. Papaioannou and Axelos' re-examination of the relation between Marx and philosophy and the return to Hegel's philosophy could be seen as an attempt at an anti-dogmatic reading of Marx. Yet the emphasis played by Papaioannou and Axelos on the philosophical origin of Marx failed to grasp Marx's thought as a theory of struggle against capitalism, and this implied a misunderstanding and disregard of Marx's work as a critique of economic categories. For Papaioannou, Marx's work contains some considerable sociological insights that should be acknowledged for their analytical and interpretive force. Papaioannou placed particular stress on Marx's thought as a, quote, theory of society, and not as a, quote, theory against society, against capitalist society, as Holloway put it. Quote, once it is understood as a theory of society, Marxism can be ranged alongside other theories of society, compared with other theoretical approaches which seek to understand society. Through this comparison, emphasis falls on the continuity rather than the discontinuity between Marxism and the mainstream theories of social science. Thus, Marx the economist is seen as a critical disciple of Ricardo, Marx the philosopher as a critical disciple of Hegel and Feuerbach. In Marxist sociology, there has been discussion of enriching Marxism with the insights of Weber. In Marxist political science, especially in the writings of many who claim to derive their inspiration from Gramsci, it is assumed that the purpose of a theory of the state is to understand the reproduction of capitalist society. End quote. In a parallel way, John Holloway. In a parallel way to Axelos and Papaioannou, Castoriadis argued that having been under the influence of capitalist ideology, Marx developed in Capital a, quote, economic system, which, quote, does not account for the functioning and evolution of capitalism, end quote. In his view, the development of Marx's thought could be seen as, quote, an evolutionary movement that estranged him from the revolutionary inspirations of his youth, so as to make him into a, quote, systematic theoretician, end quote. From this perspective, he made the claim that we have to reconsider quote, Marx's economic theory, and argue that this economic theory is, quote, tenable neither in its premises, nor in its method, nor in its structure, end quote. Hence he took great pains to demonstrate the failure of, quote, Marx's economic theory. And Capital was read as a text on economics. Once again, what is missing at crucial points in Castoriadis' critique of Marx is a clear distinction between Marx's, quote, dialectic method of expression, end quote, and the orthodox Marxist views regarding the existence of a Marxist economic theory, or Marxist political economy, with its structure and economic premises. As Simon Clark has pointed out, quote, Marxist political economy is, quote, a contradiction in terms, since Marx always referred to his work as a, quote, critique of political economy, end quote. Hans-Georg Bachhaus adds that Marx developed a critique, quote, a critical explication of economic categories, end quote, and a, quote, critique of economics, in order to destroy the, quote, categorical basis of academic economics, end quote. Marcuse expressed the same idea when he pointed out that, quote, Marxian theory rejects such a science of economics and sets in its place the interpretation that economic relations are existential relations between men, end quote. By seeking, quote, the actual content of the economy itself, and making an analysis of the origins of capitalist production, one can ascertain that this mode of production is not a, quote, natural one, but a, quote, specific historical form of existence that man has given himself. As a result, quote, once this content comes to the fore, economic theory would turn into a critical theory, end quote. Castoriadis appraised Marx as a political economist and saw in Capital, as the traditional Marxist tradition did, an alternative economic theory. In this respect, he appears not to be able to get hold of Marx's critical theory and his subsequent critique of economics. On a last note, Castoriadis, Axelos, and Papaioannou provided some valuable insights regarding the Eurocentric and Western humanist orientation of Marx's thought. Based on the Greek scholars' critique, some parts of Marx's perspective on colonialism and his projection of European historical experience on a world level could promote a great deal of question and debate. Yet a crucial issue arises here. Marx asked not to treat Hegel as a, quote, dead dog. And Axelos asked the same for Marx, not to treat him as a, quote, dead dog, not to consider him as, quote, finished and done with, end quote. The same treatment of Marx, however, cannot be found in Castoriadis' approach to Marx. Castoriadis situated Marx within the tradition of Western humanism and rationalism and considered him as a, quote, finished and done with, end quote. In a parallel way, Castoriadis championed Aristotle's thought, his political inquiry, and his questioning, quote, on the foundations of the polis and of the politeia, end quote. Yet as Murray and Schuller aptly ask, quote, why is Castoriadis able to find insight in Aristotelian text, despite their defense of slavery and hierarchy, when Marx presumably must be sacrificed to history, some atonement for the brutalities committed in his name? End quote. Murray and Schuller, Patrick Murray, and I believe it's Gene Schuller. I have an essay by Murray on this channel. It's called Capital, a Revolutionary Form. You should read it. Section 4. Freeing or freezing Marx. Papaioannou evoked Marx's positions against orthodoxy and ideological monolithism, and made an effort to, quote, rescue from oblivion, end quote, the, quote, sum total of Marx's message that has been forgotten and misted over by the clouds of incense that burn before his effigy, end quote. In the same vein, Axelos acknowledges that Marxism was, quote, castrated in the impetus of its project, quote, by the removal of the revolutionary element, end quote. According to Axelos, quote, the freeing of the truth in Marx and in Marxism would mean bringing, quote, end quote, Marx and Marxism, quote, back to a much more basic wandering, a movement which is based on nothing but which assimilates and gives rise to substructures and meanings, end quote. Did Papaioannou and Axelos, however, attempt the, quote, freeing of the truth in Marx, end quote, or try to liberate the revolutionary elements of Marx's theorizing? Axelos' reading of Marx and his emphasis on the concept of technique resonated with Heidegger's analytic categories and approach to Marx. Axelos accused Marx of metaphysics and of a lack of radicalism, but following Heidegger's thought, has Axelos managed to radicalize Marx's thought to keep Marx's questions open and at the same time to render Marx's questions more problematic? Papaioannou himself oscillated between social democratic and libertarian positions, and he came to the point of marching together with Raymond Aron on the 30th of May, 1968 in support of the right-wing government and against the May 1968 events. This lack of radicalism was also evident in Papaioannou's later theoretical development. It is thus no coincidence that the last period of his life till his early death in 1981 was marked by his return to an analysis of Lenin and Leninism. Papaioannou never worked on the conclusions of his critique of Marx and never developed the most radical aspects of Marx's thought. On this issue, Castoriadis' attitude towards Marx seems to be completely contradictory. On the one hand, he asserted that Marx is a great author, a, quote, great mind who wrote a great book, Das Kapital, end quote. For Castoriadis, the work of Marx, quote, embodies one of the most radical, even if failed, attempts toward a critique of the existing social order, end quote. This approach led Castoriadis to argue that, quote, it is clear that by analyzing the historical destiny of Marxism, I am not in any ethical sense, quote, imputing the responsibility to Marx, end quote. According to Castoriadis, even after the demise of Soviet-type regimes, quote, to draw from this collapse the conclusion that it nullifies Marx's work would be tantamount to accepting the Hegelian principle of the Weltgeschichte, or Weltgeschichte. Weltgeschichte ist Weltgericht. World history is the last judgment. That is, paradoxically, to remain a Marxist, end quote. On the other hand, he opined that, quote, apart from a few abstract ideas, nothing that is essential in capital is to be found in the reality of today, end quote. And he regarded as, quote, laughable the, quote, faithfulness to Marx that brackets the historical fate of Marxism, end quote. Castoriadis made clear that, quote, there can be no, quote, restoration, of Marxism in its original purity, nor a return to its, quote, better half, end quote, end quote. He was opposed to a, quote, particular reading of a few passages of Marx, end quote, and the, quote, omission of an infinitely greater number of texts, end quote. Castoriadis' emphasis was on the actual history of Marxism, quote, of what Marxism has actually become, of how Marxism worked and still works in real history, end quote. And Castoriadis arrived at the conclusion that Marxism is what it became in reality. Hence, quote, the return to Marx is impossible, end quote, since the, quote, full sense of the theory is, according to the theory itself, that which appears in the practice that it inspires, end quote. Following this line of thought, Castoriadis took the argument a step further. Not only is the return to Marx impossible, but also Marxism has been ruined and has come to an end. It, quote, no longer exists historically as a living theory, end quote. And according to Castoriadis, quote, we have to choose between remaining Marxist and remaining revolutionaries, end quote. Castoriadis oscillates between his two extreme and bombastic assertions, from the claim made in 1949 that, quote, we know ourselves to be the only ones who are responding in a systematic way to the fundamental problems of the contemporary revolutionary movement. We think we are the only ones who are resuming and continuing the Marxist analysis of the modern economy, end quote. To the announcement about the end of Marxism in 1964. Castoriadis seems to get confused by his effort to reconcile his intellectual origins, or the revolutionary elements which he knows exist in Marx's thought, and his ambitions not only simply to renew the revolutionary movement, but to move beyond Marx. It was Castoriadis who returned to Marx to defend him against orthodox Marxism, and he was the, quote, only one who in 1949 represented the, quote, living continuity of Marxism within society, end quote. And it was Castoriadis who, 15 years later, was entitled to announce the ruin, the end of Marxism. In fact, at this time, Castoriadis was not the, quote, only one, and was not a pioneer in announcing the end of Marxism. Castoriadis tended to forget that, quote, a philosophical doctrine has many sides, and each side may have the most diverse historical effects, end quote, and most importantly, that, quote, the end is where we start from, end quote. As Axelos reminded us, quote, one cannot propose a one-dimensional approach in reading of Marx. If someone did so, she would be dogmatic. Castoriadis made this same mistake, which he attributed to critical Marxism. Despite his claim to the contrary, he neglected the other sides of the other readings of Marx. Marx's theorizing was understood as a closed system, as a finished and definitely completed project, and not as having a, quote, open-ended character, end quote, and constituting a moment of beginning for, quote, practical critical activity. Similarly, Capital was grasped by Castoriadis as a, quote, closed book, which aimed to provide us with absolute knowledge. It was not read as a, quote, open book, and consequently it was not perceived and construed as a, quote, open-ended project. According to Axelos, quote, no one ever sufficiently puts into action the thought of the person he is discoursing with. There always remain important hidden elements which do not come to light, end quote. Given this, Castoriadis did not attempt to put Marx's thought into action. He did not go beyond his negation to free Marx, but the choice he made was to flee from Marx. The Marxian theory was seen by the Greek scholar as a theoretical system that should have lacked any contradictions and inconsistencies. Yet, needless to say, Marxian thinking is not a pure and harmonious set of doctrines that could explain everything and provide us with the ultimate and correct solutions to our problems. The key issue for critical and radical theory, then, is identifying the direction in which any critique of Marx's contradictions should be oriented. Castoriadis neither disclosed the radical elements of Marx's thinking nor attempted to liberate his theorizing from positivist and dogmatic elements. To reveal a critical and radical Marx by criticizing his, quote, orthodoxy, his orthodox aspects. We could assess Castoriadis' critique of Marx by applying Ernst Bloch's question, to him, quote, what goal and what purpose? What do we really want? End quote. Or in other words, what did Castoriadis really want when he developed his critique of Marx and Marxism? Why was he dealing with Marx? What was he aiming at? In most cases, the Greek scholar's assessment of Marx was compatible with the postmodernist critiques of Marx, whose common thread is the, quote, refusal to see Marx's critical theory, quote, as an open-ended project and the resulting attempt to, quote, freeze that project at the level of its, quote, paradigm, and thereby to reduce it to a, quote, historical philosophic theory of history, end quote, exactly that which Marx expressly denied, end quote. What is missing in the development of Castoriadis' critical theory is taking his critique of Marx through to its radical theoretical and political implications. It seems that his critique of Marx was operating in a theoretical and political framework which was already pre-constituted in the direction of not building on Marx's revolutionary elements. One of the reasons for this failure lies in his decision, mainly after the 1960s, to go beyond Marx and any Marxist perspective. The complete refutation of Marx or any Marxist critical contribution, however, could have negative implications for the function of radical and critical thought. Luxemburg made a very apt remark on this, quote, the scrupulous endeavour to keep, quote, within the bounds of Marxism, end quote, may at times have been just as disastrous to the integrity of the thought process as has been the other extreme, the complete repudiation of the Marxist outlook, and all the determination to manifest, quote, independence of thought, end quote, at all hazards, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg. The endeavor made by Castoriadis to demonstrate his, quote, independence of thought at all hazards, end quote, and to draw a marked distinction between his work and orthodox Marxism led him to an ambivalent attitude toward Marx and critical Marxism. Yet, as Horkheimer has pointed out, quote, investigation of facts is strenuous, but one at least knows what to go by, end quote. Did Castoriadis know what to go by? Similarly, a radical critique of Marx must presuppose anti-capitalism, otherwise there will be a gulf between the critique of Marx on the one hand and the social reality and ideas which this critique serves and reproduces on the other. At times, Castoriadis failed to bridge this gap and opened himself to misappropriation. As a consequence, today his ideas are mostly praised and utilized, having been deprived of any critical and radical meaning. Yet one could reply to Castoriadis' most recent celebration of his ideas with Cavafy's verse from his poem Theodotos. Quote, if you are one of the truly elect, be careful how you attain your eminence. End quote.